Those who arrived from the Caribbean before 1973 and have lived here permanently without significant periods of time away in the last 30 years have the right to remain in the UK. And as do the vast majority of long-term residents who arrived later. I don't want anybody to be in any doubt about their right to remain here.
Well, the UK Prime Minister has apologised for the government's mistreatment of Britons born to Caribbean immigrants. They arrived after World War II to fill a labour gap. But in 2010, the government destroyed their landing cards, leaving their children in some cases without proof of citizenship. Many lost jobs and were threatened with deportation. Now, Parliament is arguing over whom to blame. Well, I'm joined now from London by journalist Richard Sudan, whose grandfather was a member of the Windrush-generation. Richard, thanks so much for talking to us. This issue is very personal for you because your grandfather was one of those Caribbean immigrants. He's not alive today, but you've said if he were, he'd be very angry. Why?
Well, he would be angry because, first of all, as you say, he was part of this Windrush generation. Now, in addition to the current scandal over the Windrush generation, that's to say, people that came here in the 40s, 50s and 60s at the invitation of Britain, it's one thing that they are being treated like rubbish by the British state, but the reason he would be appalled at the treatment of migrants is because of the treatment of migrants generally, the so-called refugee crisis following wars of imperialism. So he would actually be angry on a number of fronts, a number of levels, but he would be particularly aghast at the treatment of his fellow Caribbean citizens, because it's quite one thing when the European powers went to the Caribbean and took resources and colonized our countries for so long. But then when they invited our people to come to England, like my grandfather, to help boost the labour force, to then, 4 or 5 decades later, because of rising right-wing sentiment in this country, in the UK, because of this, they are now being asked to prove their status when they came to England and London as citizens of Britain. It's absolutely unbelievable. It represents a national disgrace, and I'm going to go one further. It's not enough to have the empty words and apologies.
The empty words and apologies. I was just about to ask you that. I mean, Theresa May's apology is obviously not enough, but the government also says in its defense, some members of the government, that this was more of an unintended bureaucratic failure, not any sort of deliberate racist policy. You don't agree with that?
No, I do not agree with that, because I cannot imagine a scenario whereby other immigrants, for example, expats as they're known, other, British immigrants to other countries, had they returned to the UK, we all know they wouldn't be treated in this way. And actually, if you look at the way UK policy works, actually African Caribbeans and people from the Caribbean communities are often left in some of the most deprived communities. So the treatment of the Windrush generation has to be seen in a wider context of racism at the hands of the British state. And I think more and more, actually, this is how people are starting to frame this issue.
Okay, well, I'm going to speak on behalf of the Home Office and just, to play devil's advocate here, because they say that in deciding immigration cases, which they felt the Windrush generation actually was, they consider alternative documents, including tax records, utility bills in some cases, and that those are relatively simple to produce. So what's the problem here? If you can't come up with those landing cards to prove when you initially immigrated, why would it be so hard to come up with bills, school records, or anything else?
Well, I think we have to look at this sometimes on a case-by-case basis and remember the humanity of the people we're dealing with. There are lots of complex and nuanced reasons why the sudden demand for documentation presents a number of difficulties. Many of these people, of course, have been here for a long time, and of course, records, documents, these things get lost. And so I think it's quite an assumption for the Home Office as it revamps and cuts corners within its departments, to all of a sudden, we have to remember 40 or 50 or 60 years later to demand documentation when, by the way, the parents of the Windrush generation, they had British passports, and a lot of their children travelled, for example, on their parents' passports. And of course, not everyone necessarily always applies for a passport immediately. So the question isn't really for me about the efficiency or the management of of the Windrush generation, about how they manage their documents, and it's really about the efficiency and how the Home Office and how the British government is run and how they organise themselves, not the other way around.
Okay. On the Home Office, Theresa May was in charge of the Home Office that essentially destroyed those landing cards we talked about. She's issued an apology you don't find sincere, necessarily. Do you think she is ultimately responsible for this debacle?
I think she and her government are ultimately responsible. Theresa May is the Prime Minister now. She was in charge of the. She was obviously in charge of the campaigns people will remember, like the Go Home vans a couple of years back, which targeted immigrants when she was in the Home Office. So to answer the first part of your question, I don't think anybody who's been keeping an eye on this issue regards her apologies or her admissions as very sincere. And you know, when people get caught doing wrong, it's hard to take their apology as sincere because they've gotten caught in the act. So it's not she's not personally responsible, but she's absolutely maintaining a legacy of her government and her predecessors. And in terms of their view of immigrants, particularly from the Caribbean and elsewhere, anyone can check the history books. The Conservative government have always been arguably at the head of racist policies.
Okay, let me ask, I mean, ultimately, if you're optimistic that this can be reconciled, because it's not the first time that things like this have happened. I mean, it was only 12 years ago that the Britons changed their laws on inheriting nationality. Up until 12 years ago, it was only able to come through a man. Women and mothers did not count. You could only inherit British nationality through a father. They've corrected that. Do you think it's just a matter of time before this situation can be rightfully corrected? Or are you a lot more pessimistic than that?
I'm a bit more, cynical. I'm old enough to remember promises like these being made again. And my fear, actually, my concern, is that right now, this is a political football. The question of how Caribbean immigrants are being treated in this country. Right now, it's newsworthy because of the whole Windrush story. But my fear, actually, is that these promises we're hearing right now from the government, from the Home Office, and we're only hearing these promises because they've been they've had cases put to them, like the case of Albert Thompson. Denied his medical treatment, other cases of people losing employment. We will see what their actions are down the line, but right now there's not much to suggest they're doing anything beyond trying to deflect, trying to obfuscate, trying to diminish their own responsibility in this issue.
Okay, Richard Sudan, unfortunately we're out of time. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us from London.